introduction on school shootings. I know most people are familiar. I have a short little list of some of the biggest ones that I'm pretty sure most people in this room have heard of at least a couple of those. And so to give that issue a little bit more scope than just those couple of incidents everyone knows, a previous study I did found 47 different incidents in 26 states and Washington, D.C. that resulted in 155 victims killed, 263 more injured, and roughly 38,810 in schools at the time of those incidents. And those occurred going back to the 1970s. And so most research that has been today has focused primarily on the shooter and pre-shooting motivations, what gets them going, and that end of things. But very little has been done to see how these events unfold and how they end and what happens after. And so because so little is known about it, we don't fully understand how we can end these incidents when they do happen. And so even though there's a great deal of protective measures and trainings and different approaches that people are scrambling to get underway, almost no research or empirical data suggests any of that is effective because it just hasn't been done. So just a literature review here. We've seen an increase in frequency and severity of mass public shootings in the last several years. And following each of those, there's a perceived risk that's elevated among the general population who sees it in the news. And they often estimate that it's the risk of being involved in a mass shooting, like they just saw in the news, is 1/3 higher than any other firearm-related homicide, which in reality is a much higher chance of occurring, even though it's still rare. In both the study I did previously and the study identifying the increase, both had approximately 40% of all casualties die. And so of everyone who was injured, 40% ended up dying, which held true in both studies. So one was only on mass public shootings, and so that's everything. That's universities, that's public events, that's colleges, that's schools. And then that held true in my previous study, which only focused on K-12 schools. Even though that's 40%, there are relatively few casualties in both incidents, and it's incredibly rare occurrence. The odds were estimated to be about 1 in a million, and only 1% of those 38,000 students in school were casualties of any kind, either injured or killed. And so of that 1%, 60% were only injured. Or not to minimize anything because it is still a very catastrophic event to happen, but an incredibly high impact event. So some resolutions, according to one survey by the National Threat Assessment Center, that looked at how several school attacks went down and how they ended, which is slightly different than a school shooting. We'll get into that more later, but 51% ended without any kind of intervention, 17 ended with perpetrator suicide, 15% fled the scene, 14% surrendered, and no incidents they looked at, there was about 40 of them, that were ended by off-campus law enforcement of any kind. And so some of the more popular approaches, one very hot topic, controversial one, that is starting to see some actual employment is arming teachers, which has very mixed support among a great deal of populations. School resource officers are another particularly popular one. The theory behind both of them is put a good guy with a gun in play to counter the bad guy with a gun. And then there's also more procedural methods like lockdowns or run, hide, fight, which is exactly what it sounds like. And then there's also the employment of threat assessment teams who kind of try and proactively deal with those who would engage in shootings, which has been very effective at not just countering these type of shootings, but any other disciplinary or behavioral problems found at school. To kind of summarize that previous study, because that's among the only studies I found very few that even touch this topic, aside from the one I did previously. And so that was a 2x3 unbalanced, examined the effect of shooting response procedures on casualty rates and the trainings we've done. And so, on average, 3.3 victims killed, 5.6 injured, and about 826 students in school at the time of the attack. In the number of victims killed, procedure or schools with a dynamic procedure like Alice or Run, Hide, Fight, where there's multiple options, it's very shooting dependent in how it evolves, had fewer casualties than those with static when looking strictly at the raw numbers. But when we shift to per capita for the school, static and dynamic had fewer casualties than those with no procedure. And then it was very interesting because schools with no kind of training at all on their policies had fewer casualties than either instructed or instructional, like a PowerPoint classroom instruction end of things, and practice, so more of the drill, when examined per capita. And so that was a very interesting finding. For injured, static and dynamic, again, were fewer than none. Practice did end up being better than no training in terms of the number of casualties injured. And then there's a hierarchy that kind of forms per capita, which is about what most people would expect, with the Alice type training being best, and then static, and then none. And then no training, again, was better than practice when adjusted per capita, which was very interesting, especially when you consider some of the scales of the schools that happen, where it's one-room schoolhouses that were shot up and half of the students were injured or killed. But one of the most interesting findings there is the confrontations between potential victims and the shooters often superseded the impact of procedures or training on the outcome. A lot of the time, the procedure was enacted after the shooting was over, and few even lasted long enough to play a role in how, or for the procedure to play a role in how it went down. Because oftentimes it was very limited geographically within the school, where it's a singular room or only a hallway that's affected, and then it's seconds. I think it's not on here, but I think in that NTAC study, about 50% of shootings ended within 5 minutes. It could be less. And so the procedures really made no difference. And in some cases, they were unable to be fulfilled. For example, in Columbine, there were locks or doors that didn't lock. There was about 50 students that took shelter in the library that didn't have a door on it. And the shooters went in there, did kill some of them. And then others, there's nowhere to hide. And Red Lake shooting, I believe, the perpetrator was able to see victims through a window and shoot without even needing to enter the room. And then evacuation routes in those Alice trains could also be exposed to fire from the shooter. I believe that in the Oxford High School shooting in Michigan, the shooter did fire at fleeing students from a window of the school. And so this is a largely unexplored area, and so the state of the research is pretty bad. There's very little quality centralized data. There's probably about 6 or 7 big databases, and most of them are not publicly accessible, and it's not per incident, where it's this incident happened, this is what happened there, these are the casualties. It's very cumulative. And so that makes analysis in this area very difficult. And they also are not coordinated, so they all have different definitions, and that makes it very hard to compare. And these are rare incidents. Most studies have 60 maximum school shootings that meet their criteria, unless it's a very loose definition. The research questions for this particular study was examining whether there's a significant difference in the distribution between successful and unsuccessful uses of the different confrontation modalities, which we're going to get into in a minute. Is there a significant difference in the effectiveness of the different confrontation modalities? So are they comparatively effective? And then is there a significant difference in the distribution modalities worked at different casualty levels? So is one specific type more effective when there's more casualties and another more effective when there's less? So we're trying to figure out that. And so here's the fun statistical hypotheses. The first three kind of get into that first research question, examining each of the different types. There's armed, physical, and verbal, which we'll get into the definitions of each in just a moment. Question 4 is about that correlation between modality and effectiveness to see if there's that relationship. And then the last three, again, examine the casualty levels and the distribution of successful modalities in each. And so the design is a non-factorial between and within subjects, non-repeated mixed measures design. And there were internal analyses conducted to investigate the relationship between confrontation modality and success ending incidents, and to examine the distribution of successful confrontation modalities at different casualty levels. And so the procedure began with the end of the previous study and identifying confrontation as a significant intervening variable that really limited the application of those findings. And so a project regarding that variable was designed, thesis was proposed and approved, definitions were created, scoring and exclusion criteria were also created to get an idea of the scope of this one, and then multiple public, online, accessible databases were examined for relevant incidents. Basically, I went in, looked at all of the databases I could find that had a list of incidents, figured out which one met my specific criteria, and then input that data. Or once those were found, went into the local news articles or whatever news or reports were available on each, which oftentimes was you would be surprised, it was like a singular news article from like that time, and then there was another one like that shooting 20 years later, and that was everything I had to work with. So that kind of touches back on that data quality and availability. And then all of the incident information I could find was put into that spreadsheet, organized, and then analyzed. And so now we're getting into those definitions. School shooting was basically, when you think of the stereotypical rampage style school shooting, that's what we're trying to encapsulate here. Some of the biggest points to note are it's premeditated, intent to cause harm, targeting a K-12 school and in the United States, and during school hours, and that it was unrelated to other criminal activity. So that excludes any kind of gang violence, any type of argument where it's more limited, and it doesn't include any incidents where a firearm was simply discharged at a school or harmlessly into something else. It had to have been intentional, and so accidents are also ruled out. Confrontation is any action taken by an individual who's a potential victim or otherwise related to school, so law enforcement, students, faculty, staff, parents, anyone in that vicinity who confronts a shooter to stop the incident, pretty much. Armed confrontations, any use of a weapon, which was most commonly a firearm, though there was an incident where a student used a pencil to try and attack the shooter that was counted as armed, as he did use an implement to do harm to the shooter. Physical is without that kind of a weapon, so any attempt to just exert physical control, barehanded, tackling, wrestling, that manner of thing. And then verbal is any non-physical contact, so speaking to them, trying to talk them down, yelling, and or just approaching them to make contact. Whatever the highest level that was used is the one that each incident was marked at. So if a law enforcement officer approached, all law enforcement interactions were marked as armed because they had the weapon on them. That's a fairly common thing, and so it can't be ruled out that that was a part of the interaction. But if an individual starts by trying to talk them down and then tries to wrestle with them, then that's coded as a physical interaction. And then non-confrontation is any incident that ends some way other than confrontation. So, for example, the shooter is off in the side, sees law enforcement arriving at the school, and decides to kill themselves. That is not a confrontational, or if they decide to flee the scene, stuff like that. Successful is where the shooter is unable to or does not re-engage other victims, or otherwise ends the shooting either killing themselves or fleeing the scene and not attempting any other shooting. Unsuccessful, they are unable, or they are still able to continue the attack, re-engage other victims, continue to engage victims, or overwhelm the person trying to confront them. Total casualties is just the number of killed and injured together, so that's the overall impact pretty much. And that's split into 3 levels: high, medium, low, which was done using a quarter 1 and quarter 3 split. Anything with more than 9.5 is high, between 2 and 9.5 is medium, and then less than 2 is low. And so I identified 55 incidents between 1988 and 2024 in K-12 schools in the US that were in 30 states and Washington, D.C. There were 442 total casualties, averaging about 8 per incident. 14 or 25% of attacks were high casualty, 29, which was about 53% were medium, and 13, which was 24% were low. And then incident endings, 40 of them, which was 71%, ended with confrontation, and 16, which was about 29%, did not end from confrontation. Of those confrontations, there were 56, so averaging just over 1, which was very interesting because some attacks had none, but the most was 3. 27%, so 48% of all confrontations were armed. 29%, which was 16, were physical, and then 23% were verbal. Overall, confrontation was effective 71% of the time, and unsuccessful 29% of the time. So that's pretty good overall. That's a good number. And then I used cluster and convenience sampling using those databases, what was in there, and shootings I was aware of to identify incidents for this. For analysis, 56 confrontation episodes were used, so all of those confrontations used. In the incident at the STEM School's Highland Ranch, there were 2 shooters who split up. Both were successfully confronted, and so both are marked in the successful, at that casualty level as being successful. 55 incidents were used. The Q1, Q3 split were used for determining casualty level for that analysis. Used a chi-squared for goodness of fit and a chi-squared for independence at the alpha level of 0.05. So the armed confrontation was significantly effective at 78%, chi-square 8.33, pretty low p-value 0.004, and so 78% of the time it worked, and 22% of the time did not. This was, again, the most commonly used, and so that's pretty promising. Physical confrontation was also significantly effective, and more significantly effective than, or not more, but had a higher success rate than armed did, which was interesting, though there is a fairly limited sample size, so 1 can make a bigger difference in the percentage. But that was a chi-square 6.25 and p-value of 0.012. And then there was also a significant difference in the successful modalities at the high casualty level. And so 50% were armed, 43% were non-confrontational, and only 1 was physical. None of them were successfully ended with verbal confrontation. And so chi-square 10.57, p-value 0.014. And so